We're live. Shall we talk about leadership? I have an agenda for you. So let me show you that and retreat to the corner of your screen. And we'll go through a presentation I believe will last about 15 minutes or so. That at least is my plan. So first things first is just to point out that we're going to be looking at the difference between managing and leading in this principles week of the leadership module. And there's a big difference between managing and leading, and I'll explain why in a short bit. In order to explain the difference, I'm going to have to tell you what leadership is. And number three, the point of all of this is that leadership is or has a lot to do with power and the use of power. And then finally, in this principles module, we'll talk about leading in the kind of way that allows people that report to you to have a bit of power themselves. First things first, let's get that out of the way. Not all leaders are managers, and not all managers are good leaders. But the point is, we know this from what we learned of the birth of scientific management back in the early part of the last century. We learned that managers plan, lead, organize, and control. And that leading component is part of the activities that a manager has to perform. You don't perform the activities, you're not going to be doing much leading. The critical thing for any manager is to learn how to lead, even if it is in a mechanical way. But some people, and this is what we'll do in the subsequent lecture, some people are just phenomenal in so much as the personal influence that they have is something which tends to move people to achieve more than what they could if they were simply left to their own devices. So if we continue down this road, this statement, this assertion I make to you that not all leaders are managers, and conversely that not all managers are leaders, the point is that leaders are people who don't necessarily enjoy the authority of a manager, whereas a manager is always in some way appointed to the level of management which comes with a title. So at the very top of the organization, our university, for example, has a vice chancellor. And then we have a smattering of managers right throughout the organizational hierarchy. The distinction, however, between management on the left-hand side of your screen and leadership on the right-hand side of your screen is that primarily management is about position and positional power, whereas leadership is about social power and the influence which arises from the practices and the behaviors performed by the manager. The kind of illustration that you'll be able to pick up from your textbook is going to be a complex one. And I'm going to point out to you that it's not necessarily as bad as it seems. All we have here is a notion. And that notion is that on the left-hand side of your screen, you have a lot of power being used. And on the right-hand side of your screen, you have very little power being used. As a consequence of which, we distinguish the nature of managers who tell and managers who consult and sell, and managers who simply let you get on with it. Now, in the subsequent lesson, we're going to learn that perhaps allowing people to simply get on with it is not necessarily the best thing. But I suggest you surf to this particular illustration in your textbook and you devote some time to looking at these principles. If we were to define leadership, we say it's about leading. Now, my thing is that managers can do that sort of leading and they can do it pretty well, some better than others, but it's still not what we refer to and what we'll learn about in the next lesson as transformational leadership. Leadership which is so sincere, so authentic, and so inspiring that people will go beyond what you would ordinarily expect them to do and behave in ways you would ordinarily not expect them to behave, simply because they're so inspired by the leader manager. And manager leaders, on the other hand, typically don't achieve that level of inspiration. The the definition in front of you now that I've just flashed up is, I'll read to you, the process by which a person exerts influence over other people and inspires, motivates, and directs their activities to help achieve group or organizational goals. I'm going to say here that that is a misleading definition. It's extracted from your textbook and it's accepted on at face value, but it seems to imply that anyone can influence, and the point is that anyone with power certainly can. But I'll also point out to you that sometimes leadership fails, and I'll illustrate that in just a bit. The person who's undertaking this leadership, the person in charge, as I write it there, is the person who leads from the front, who has followers, and that gives rise to a list of points, if you like, or key elements, and that is that there is a social influence which is not about positional power and or authority, and that you have to have followers if you're going to be leading anyone. And if it is about relationships and power, as you see on the screen in front of you now, then good leadership is going to be characterized and illustrated by sincerity and authenticity, and not just positional power and the use and abuse of positional power. It gives rise, of course, to different styles of leadership, and this is what the next session is based on. But we studied, I think in week 2 or 3, was it? Or perhaps 4, the nature of a manager's values. And we're saying now that one's instrumental values and terminal values are going to complexion the nature of someone's leadership style. So if one leads with a conscience because one has a sincere desire to make things better for people, then you recognize that there's going to be a particular style which is going to be inclusive because of the conscionable acts of the leader, as opposed to a more instrumental or mechanical leadership which says followers are simply subordinates, and subordinates need to get the job done and they can be bossed around to do so. It's also the case, however, and this is a primary principle and a bit of a contestable one, that the kind of leadership you see across cultures is something which is in fact different. And I believe that if we can distinguish in an American textbook that Americans and Europeans and the Japanese, for example, are distinctive in their style, and it begs the question that perhaps there is for us here at home in Mzansi a unique African management style. And if we were to make that assertion, then we would have to look to what the evidence is, and the evidence is a little bit thin, but my research demonstrates or illustrates for us that the difficulty in asserting that there is a management style that happens in a place is something which has to make us ask 3 questions. And the first is that human behavior can't be assumed to be universal, while there are aspects of universal or behavior which is universally applied or exhibited. Human beings are somewhat unique, so culture is going to affect how you behave, but it doesn't necessarily, particularly when we look at the other 2 features here, or the other 2 questions, it isn't going to render something uniquely African. We also can't ask whether organizational structure is universal. In fact, I correct myself there. We can ask whether it is universal, and in truth, it is pretty much the same wherever you go. You get bosses and you get followers or subordinates, and it's not unusual to find a tiered hierarchy with a senior person at the top of the organization, in the expensive company car, and then a scattering of followers throughout the organization, cascading in the hierarchy with which we became familiar when we were looking at organization. The processes also of organizations are not necessarily universal, although there are a great deal of similarities. So we turn over here to Ejiofor, who is cited by Zelebi, and he says that the transferability of management theory is in fact a cardinal principle of management. He maintains we do see a kind of universality that you can't in fact distinguish between African management and Japanese or American management. He points out the universality of management principle regards managers to perform the same function regardless of their place in the organization structure or the type of enterprise in which they are engaged. In other words, the necessity to perform the job is fundamental, and the nature of the job is universal. One can tend to overlook the effects of multiplicity of cultural, organizational, situational, and individual differences facing management, however. So I'll leave you with the question, you're first-year students, and I believe that only in 2 or 3 years' time can we start asking deeper questions about whether there is in fact a unique African management or not. Let's leave that for now and point out that all of this rests or vests on the basis of this power I've been talking about. And a long time ago, goodness me, that's a long time ago. So in 1959, French and Raven said there are 5 sources of power. There is legitimate power, which is the assigned power that comes with the position. In other words, the person at the top of the organization has the most power, and the manager at the lower end of the organization has the least power. There's reward power, coercive power, expert power, referent power, and to that we can add a reciprocal power. And I'm going to urge you to become familiar with those, because whenever one gives a student a list, you recognize as a student that you can expect the person giving you the list is going to be asking you questions about that list. So there's a hint for you, if you like. You better study that up. So they illustrated this for us. They pointed out that there's a distinction between formal power and personal power. And personal power arises from one's expertise, and formal power arises from one's appointed authority. In other words, you can coerce as someone who's appointed as a manager, and you can influence through your expertise in respect of your personal power. So the first set is based upon formal authority as it's regarded here, as opposed to the second set, which is based upon individual competence. And that's the distinction. I'm going to urge you to acknowledge that there is a caution, and the caution is that on this side of the picture, it is the case that even though there is power, sometimes leadership fails. And on this side of the picture, leadership actions are also not necessarily going to be absolutely successful. And that's simply because even if a leader on this side of the picture, this side of the screen, is someone who is remarkably socially influential, that has a potential dark side, in so much as sociological leaders can abuse the admiration of their followers. What we find in business practice is that we see the necessity for strong transformational leaders to arrest decline in organization and set it right. But then there's a point when they have to make way for leaders who will not lead on the basis of their charisma, but lead more on the basis of technique and process. So The question I asked, which might have slipped past you, but which I had already asked at the beginning of the session, is something I can sketch for you. Leadership actions, in other words, can give rise to successful outcomes as well as unsuccessful outcomes. But very critically, successful outcomes, what you see here, is something which comes in a gradient. In other words, very successful is actually very effective, and moderately successful is actually ineffective. The goal in respect of what we're trying to achieve in any enterprise is what you see in this trajectory here. Okay. Now, going through those 5 or 6 powers, if you include reciprocal power, is something that I'm going to obligate you to do on your own. There are numerous examples in the text, and you need to look at reward power and the preceding legitimate power, clearly reward power, coercive power, expert power, referent power, and then finally reciprocal power. I anticipate that you will have taken, by the time you finish this video, screenshots of each of those pages. Alternatively, you have to labor through the textbook chapter. Then we turn finally to this notion of empowerment, which I'm going to say is really just an exercise that we can call delegation, because that's what empowerment really is. And by empowering people, we must recognize that we haven't necessarily achieved any great things, simply because that overconfidence of the leader, or alternately a lack of confidence by the leader, and potentially a lack of supervisory capability, and the absence of controls, and just poor psychological temperament, and some unwillingness, if you like, on the part of subordinates to accept enhanced responsibility that comes from having things delegated to you, are all problems with delegation. Do you recognize that what you see over here is something which I'm able to examine or assess, particularly so with objective test, or what we refer to here as multiple choice questions? So let's summarize this all and get to the end of the session. You learn that leadership and management are not one and the same thing, so you have to be able to distinguish the difference in terms of definitions. Leadership is what managers have to do, but there's no guarantees here that every manager is going to be an effective leader, even if they enjoy the authority and power which theoretically entitles them to overcome resistance from subordinates. Power typically comes, first of all, from formal authority, but there are also individual qualities and competencies, such as personal expertise. What is authoritative leadership is more often than not the case just autocratic managerialism. And finally, influential leadership is what happens when individuals and managers enjoy social influence over their subordinates and their peers. I'm going to leave you with that, because I think that what we've covered here is sufficient for you to be able to access the material that is in the textbook and make sense of it. So until our next session, thank you for your time and attendance here.